Let's talk about 1984 by George Orwell. This has been a bit of a long time coming. I've been wanting to talk about this book for a while, and in fact, I've got so much that I want to say about it that I might have to split this in two episodes. I was thinking of laying this one off for a while, but it came up in conversation again today, and I realized this. Yeah, I want to. I want to jump into it. So it's probably my favorite book. It's probably my favorite book. There are some books in the non-fiction genre which I think would compete in terms of how much I've enjoyed them, but and certainly for the fiction genre, 1984 has always been almost in a league of its own for me. No other book I've read has interested me in quite the same way. Um, and I know the exact reason for that. In fact, there's a couple of reasons. When I first read 1984, it was just as I was starting my philosophical education. I was really just starting to think about things. And right on the heels of that, I read it and I found, firstly, I'd never really had much trucked with, I never really put much stock in fiction before. I always thought that non-fiction was the stuff that could really do the heavy lifting. But that was one of the books that really showed me what fiction could do in terms of exploring ideas. And more importantly, it was the ideas that it actually explored. The brilliant thing about 1984 is that within one book, you get a clear idea of both the importance and the relationship between truth, language, politics, and history. In one fell swoop, it shows the relationship between all four of those things and more, right? Um, and the other thing that I really love about it is I like Orwell's style. Um, I'm actually I'm a fan of keeping things simple if we can. I really do enjoy that, and I like his approach to the writing because it's a very easy book to read, just from a language point of view. Obviously, the content is quite harsh, but just to read it, it's very easygoing. It's very straightforward, and that's brilliant to me because the topics are so heavy. And so I admire Orwell's skill with that. I admire Orwell's skill of being able to express deep, complex ideas, not only in narrative, but also in simple language. Fantastic. So I read it again recently, and this is the first time that I've read it since becoming a Catholic. And so much more of it makes sense now than it did in the past. And I think that's what I want to talk about, at least today, because I imagine that if you go and listen to summaries of 1984 from other perspectives, it will talk a lot about the politics and a lot about the language, rightly so, and maybe I'll talk about that myself in the future. But what I really realized this time round is that the 1984 is fascinating because it's a glimpse into the mind of the devil. It really is. 1984 and the world that's depicted in that novel really is the world if the devil tried to invent it or tried to design it. And you might say, well, come on, that's a bit of a reach, isn't it? Because there's no mention of the devil or God at all in the Bible. And I would say, exactly. Exactly. Because, we all know the old adage that the devil's greatest trick was convincing everyone that he didn't exist, or that he doesn't exist. And I think the fact that 1984 depicts a world which is devoid of any societal conversation about a god or demons or religion is, it kind of proves the point. The devil doesn't want a world in which everyone's arguing about his existence or how he stands up against God. He wants a world in which no one thinks about God at all, or him, right? Because if you posit his existence, you posit something that opposes that. So that's the kind of first thought that came to mind. Religion doesn't exist in the world of 1984. and what a different world it would be if it actually did. Perhaps it wouldn't be that world at all. So what I also then realized was that there's so much about how 1984 depicts the logic of evil. And it does that by depicting the logic of power, which is basically the logic of pride. I came to realize that they're all basically the same thing. Now, let me just take a step back for a second. When I was reading 1984, the last time, recently, a few months ago, I was also reading two other books at the same time. One of them was Hostage to the Devil by Malachi Martin, which is a book about demonic possession. And the other one was The Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis. And a bunch of dots connected for that reason. In 1984, the whole point of the party's existence, as OBrien says towards the end, by the way, spoilers alert, if you haven't read it, go read it. Go read it. What O'Brien says at the end, what O'Brien says at the end is that they do all of this. They wield this monolithic, ultimate totalitarian control for the sake of power. And there's even a point where Winston tries to tell him what he thinks he wants to hear. He says, you'll tell me that you're doing all this for our own good because this is for the betterment of mankind, to save us from ourselves, all this kind of stuff. And O'Brien buzzes him and says, no, Winston, wrong. Power. This is all simply power. And we want you to accept that. Now, when I first read that a few years ago, I thought that was the weakest part of 1984. It didn't make any sense to me. Everything else kind of made sense. The idea of the constant surveillance, the totalitarian control, the lying to the people to keep their minds imprisoned. Even the idea of doublethink, as horrific as it was, even if I didn't fully appreciate it, I kind of got that. It still kind of fitted in. But that idea of why would the government do this? Why would people who want power do this to people? And the answer of the book is, well, they do it for power's own sake. And I thought that seemed ridiculous. How is that even possible? How could power for its own sake be such a motivating factor? The point is, really, that's true. It's true. Power really does become a motivator for its own sake. And that's, I think, the first stage to understanding where the diabolical comes into it. Now, when I was reading Screwtape Letters, this version of Screwtape I had it had a preface, which I think was written by Lewis himself. And in that, he was explaining the hierarchy of hell that he had designed for the demons, and was trying to explain his kind of logic behind it. And he made this very interesting point during that explanation. He said, in hell, the demons are not motivated by this abstract concept called evil. They're not trying to pursue evil for its own sake. The demons are simply trying to serve themselves. So even if they form into a hierarchy, all of the demons will lie and backstab and cheat and smile and work their way through each other simply for their own betterment and gain. Okay? And so in that way, each devil is kind of ambling forward or clawing its way forward to try and gain more power. Because think about it, what is power really in this sense being portrayed by Orwell, or in the demonic sense? Power in this sense is the ability to get others to do your will, right? To be extensions of your own will. And that's pride, right? That fundamentally is pride, because it's about making everyone else simply you, right? Thinking you are important enough that other people should just simply be extensions of that. They should serve your desires. They should serve your wants. Your goals, no, not your goals. Their goals should be your goals, and everything flows as a secondary thing to you, right? And so it was very interesting when Lewis described it as a kind of consumption. He said, those spirits, when it comes to us, they want to consume us, right? It's almost like in a spiritual sense, we're kind of food to them. They want if our will is kind of like a food, they want to eat it so that it is part of them. And so our will is no longer our own, right? It's just taken up within their own power, within their own pride. It's sucked into themselves. And then he said that the demons, perfectly logical to think that the demons do that to each other, right? In the hierarchy of hell, the demons eat each other. So the lesser demons are simply extensions of the will of the more powerful demons. Now, just as a very interesting side note, when I was reading Hostage to the Devil, where he was explaining demonic possessions that had taken place, there was exactly one demonic possession that had exactly that kind of relationship in it, where there is basically a lesser demon, and then his kind of cover gets blown, if you like, and then it turns out that it wasn't that lesser demon at all. It was actually just a more powerful demon above it, which was simply wearing this lesser demon as a kind of mask. So that's evil. That's how evil works. It's about consuming everything into your own self, despite its own, no matter, with no regard for its good whatsoever, right? With no regard whatsoever for its good. Only your good matters. And that's why this political sense of power that we see in the world, and that we see, yes, cartoonized, but kind of emphasized in 1984, is power based on pride. It's just the extension of pride to what? The political sphere, the sphere of governance, the sphere of worldly authority, right? So that might all seem like a lot of preamble. What has this got to do with 1984? It's got everything to do with 1984. Because again, Winston's pressing question for the whole book was why? Why? I understand how. I do not understand why they would do this. And that all brings me back to a line by O'Brien during those final scenes, where he described the fact that the party in 1984, the government, needs everyone to think exactly what the party thinks. And not only to think what the party thinks, but to actually be willing to believe whatever the party thinks, right? Now, what does that tell you? It tells you that the party wants everybody to simply be an extension of its own will, of its own self, right? And there's a line that O'Brien says where he basically describes, 100 million people, all with the same face. Yeah. 100 million people, none of them individuals, but all of them simply the party. That's pride. That's pride realized in this mortal world. Whoever this leader is, whoever this all-powerful dictator of the human race might be, he has no concern for any particular individual. He just wants everyone to simply be an extension of himself. And if anyone is miserable in that process or gets crushed under that fact, it means nothing at all. If anything, they need only be disposed of, because everyone else is simply a tool to his means. Now, I had an interesting conversation with someone about 1984 today, and one of the things that transpired was the fact that, you know, why is O'Brien, for example, doing this to Winston? Because in those scenes where O'Brien is torturing Winston, Winston is, O'Brien is representing the party, and Winston is just representing the average man who's under its power. But here's the thing: who is O'Brien, right? As a party member, how much of his own personality does he really have? How much of himself is he really? But he is simply another part of the party wearing its face, right? In that sense, O'Brien is in an equally tragic situation. And the thing is, another really you might think of this as a small thing, but one of the most striking things of 1984 was when it described the lodgings of the people who lived within those cities, right? And obviously, you very quickly get the description of Winston's lodgings, which are all very bleak and very run down, and nothing works, and it's all horrible and cold and sticky. But then even if you go to O'Brien's lodgings, by comparison, they're practically palatial. But O'Brien's lodgings, as they're described in that book, are not anywhere near as good as the average, like, city flat that you'd get in the modern day. This probably wasn't as good as the average house that Orwell would have lived in during his time. So by relative standards, the inner party members, for example, the real top dogs of that society, still live in relative discomfort, relative poverty, I suppose you would say, compared to if they just lived in a society that didn't have all those horrible lies and tyranny. And so there O'Brien is torturing Winston as his superior, as the top of the society, as the party itself. But not as O'Brien, really. Right? Not as O'Brien. And so the price he's paid for that is to actually have any chance. He's paid two prices for that. He's paid the price of living in a world that could be better. He's given that up. And secondly, he's actually paid the price of his self. Right? So in that sense, it's a tragic situation on both sides of the torture chamber. But this is why this is an insight into the mind of evil. Because what if there was yet another entity that sat above O'Brien, and O'Brien was simply an extension of him? And I think 1984 makes perfect sense if you imagine that entity is the devil. Every single person in that society, through their hate and their misery and their constant unrest and their constant suffering and the severance between them and goodness and truth and beauty and God, that is the life of the devil, right? That is the soul of the devil expressed through a society. And so the devil, because you've got to remember, what's the devil's goal? The devil hates us, right? Hates us. And not only wants us to live miserably, but wants us to go to hell, right? Now, what better way to do that than to create the world of 1984 in which everyone does live dejectedly and miserably, and they don't even know who God is, right? And so he can win at all levels. He can steal the soul. He can steal the identity of O'Brien and give him a pittance in return, because O'Brien knows that he's richer than Winston. And then in the process, he can steal the soul of Winston and then all of the people who are even underneath him, 100 million people, 100 billion people, all with the same face. all in hatred, all marching towards hell. And so what does the devil need in order for that to work? Well, he just needs people to want power and to do whatever they can to take it. Because whether you believe in the devil or not, that whole idea of power really does show the logic of evil, and it shows that it's that pride in that sense is the archetype of evil. Pride at the individual level is still that hungering desire for the world or the people around you or everything to bend to your will for your satisfaction, right? For what you perceive as your own selfish good. Now, the reason why so many people don't manifest that pride in the form of a totalitarian government is because people simply don't have the authority, political power, or strength or resources to do so, right? But if you have someone with sufficient pride and you gave them all the resources and the power and the guns in the world, what would their society look like, right? And I don't think you have to read much history to know just how that logic works. So what is that? It's reflecting human nature at different levels, right? And it's always going back to that main central point. Because again, what does that tell us? Well, there's the pursuit of pride, which realizes itself ultimately in power, and power consumes those it has power over in this sense. The power of God is fundamentally different, and in fact diametrically opposed to this, but I'll get onto that in a second. But you have pride, and pride really realizes itself in power. And then therefore, when OBrien says power for the sake of power, it's actually a way of saying pride for the sake of pride. It's simply that base, fundamental, underlying assumption that one's self is the superior thing. And even if Brian is seeming altruistic because he's regarding himself as the party, no, in this sense, he still basically regards the party as himself. And ultimately, that means that he is simply wearing the mask of someone else. But it's pride. It's pride at the end of the day. Now, the final interesting thing to kind of juxtapose this idea was when, going back to Lewis, he talked about how the two forms are opposites to each other, that being hatred, prideful hatred, and really selfless love. Okay? And it's all to do with how we interact with the wills of other people. He explained that the devils consume each other, they eat each other, right? The wills are consumed into a single will. All faces become simply an extension of that one face, and not themselves. Now you might say, doesn't that describe God? Because God wants all of our wills to be his? He does, but in a very different sense. Evil would have will consumed without any free volition of its own. In fact, to the point where all free volition is completely removed, right? If the party really has its way in 1984, there is no such thing as free will. There is only the will of the party. God, on the other hand, is exactly the opposite. God, despite being power itself, in the real just sense, wants those who are willing to cooperate with him to do so in complete and utter freedom. Even if all they have is his own grace, if all they have is his own mercy and beauty and truth and power, it is still, he wants to make them completely and utterly themselves, distinctly, right? Maybe in 1984, everyone is OBrien, or everyone is the devil. But in the kingdom of God, John really is John, and Paul really is Paul, and Matthew really is Matthew. But they're all still I suppose you'd call it reflections, not extensions, but willing reflections of the will of God, in the same way that mirrors might willingly reflect sunlight back, right? They're willing reflectors of God in the same way that if a diamond could choose, it could allow the sunlight to go into it and then be pushed out again in all of its different directions. That's the difference. The love of God, the hatred of the devil sucks in and crushes, it consumes, whereas the love of God pours out and pushes forward. It's a great outward movement. Love is a great outward motion into the world, into truth, into beauty. And that's why it's extensive and expansive and creative, whereas hatred can only crush and pull in and destroy. And in fact, it ultimately collapses underneath its own weight. In that sense, the demonic hatred and pride is like a black hole that sucks everything into it. Whereas the love of God is like sunlight, which pushes everything out, right? And shines everything forth. So that we, as his children, are at once willingly united to him and part of him, just as the light of the sun is part of the sun. But in that sense, we are still clearly distinct from it too, as ourselves. And that's the perfection of the relationship of love, where we rejoice, we love because we rejoice that someone is not exactly ourselves, you know. John is happy that he is not Paul, and that Paul is actually Paul and himself, different, unique, new in some way, that he is not. Whereas hatred has the complete opposite respect, and hates everyone for not being itself, right? And so I think that's one of the many things that we can learn from 1984. It can teach us about the nature of evil and the logic behind it and its rationale and how to, I suppose, comprehend it. And then it can also, on the flip side of that, teach us about the nature of goodness itself as its opposite, and really consider what it means for love to be what it is. That'll be all. Thank you for your time.